Howdy, howdy, everybody. Whitney, can you hear me? And everybody else that's here. Okay, great. Awesome. Thanks, everyone, for joining. But we are going to give a minute or two for the not as early birds. So get your coffee, as I am, hopefully not drinking too much, just a sip or two. Normally when I have a chat functionality, one of my favorites is what was the most recent concert you went to? And mine was Bratfall at Charlie XCX. Yeah, this is my favorite mug, especially for stuff that's recorded. Gotta get that alpaca screen time. Just give one more minute on the clock. But excited there's so many people here. Thank you all for coming. Obviously here to talk about my favorite thing, which is risk-based alerting, if you didn't know the full acronym. Sometimes people throw in a few other words for the A, attribution, the analytics, but basically all the same thing. But yeah, we'll get started here because I want to talk about how to take your breath away with RBA. I just made that because it rhymed, and also I really like that song from Top Gun. But truly, like when RBA succeeds, we truly see breathtaking results. I had a friend who built it out, and then before he was getting hired by another company, he didn't even put the actual numbers of their like alert reduction and stuff in his resume because he thought it would just sound kind of overblown. Yeah, when we see people succeed with RBA, it really is a breathtaking experience. So thank you all for joining me today. As you're all used to, legal, business, business, forward-looking statements may be made. But yeah, this is me with different color hair. I swear it's still me. I am a staff security strategist over here at Splunk. Security strategist, we wear a lot of different hats, but basically I'm an engineer who used to engineer, and now I'm an engineer who makes PowerPoints. So happy to present one of those to you today. I am actually engineering as well in the background. I've got some exciting RBA features that will be coming into product probably next year. But before we get started, I'm just so curious. What is everyone's familiarity with RBA? I talk to people of all types. This talk is general. Is this poll active? Whitney, I don't know if I need to do anything to make it go. I just see that nobody's submitted an answer yet, and I'll give you a sec. There we go. Okay, it's probably a little delay on the streaming. Yeah, because I'm working with all sorts of people. I've geared this more as sort of the introductory, but we do have time for questions at the end. And I also talk about some of the cool things our customers are doing with their RBA implementations. So yeah, I'm curious what this crowd is like. Because yeah, if you notice some of the answers there, like I even put that question at the end there. We've built RBA, but it doesn't seem to be providing value as attendant. because it's a different approach. Can be difficult to if you're not prepared in the right way or just familiar with the methodology. Sometimes you turn things on and are trying to figure out how to get that value. So I'm seeing the numbers about 50% of you. Thank you for submitting your democratic vote here. I'm so curious, what are the numbers? Okay, awesome. Okay, well, we did get someone in group E as not providing value as intended. So I'd love to get some questions. As I go along, feel free to submit a question. But yeah, we've got 30% not just knowing the word, 46.7 haven't implemented. So we have a question in the chat just to talk about implementation at the end if we don't get any questions. But I've also got resources to point you to, and yeah, started implementing, not in production, got about 10%, and then we built RBA, 10%. Great, I love that. Okay, cool, so we've got a good mix here. I'd love to hear questions from some of the folks in that final category, because I definitely want to get that value out of RBA, because I know it can be done. I swear it's done pretty regularly. But for all those new folks, since that is the vast majority, let's start out with what is RBA? What's the general idea? What's the gist here? And you may have sort of heard this in sort of like how it's marketed or sold, but this is the reality of security operations still to this day. I built RBA like 4 years ago, and we still have this issue. I think part of the difficulty is that organizations want to do security, and logs are relevant to security. Almost every log is relevant to security. And then what I ran into as a detection engineer who used to be an analyst who was tired of working alerts over and over and over again of the same thing that wasn't bad, is that as we improve our visibility, we create more alerts. And even if let's say you make 4 new detections in a month, but each one of those is making 10 false positives in a month and no true positives, or maybe 1 or 2, that's 40 new false positives you've now introduced to the monthly workload of your analysts. And it's just unsustainable to continue to develop more alerting, because we want the visibility. Like, that's the idea when we create detections. We want that visibility into our data sources, but aggregation becomes the issue. When you're just looking at a single event in isolation, you're not really getting a story. You're just like, well, something weird happened. Can you investigate anything about it to see if it's relevant? So depending on the place, we may have playbooks that are relevant to the type of detection. Like if it's in the network category or if it's in web, then we look at those events. But ultimately, we're leading to either abandoned alerts where it's not first in, first out. It's just like, well, look at the criticals and everything else is just in there. We suppress a lot, so we lose some of our visibility. We just ultimately have slow detection and response, and analysts burn out. They just get tired. I think burnout, fatigue is before burnout, but you don't want them to get to that state. So it's pretty common, and that's where a lot of us are. So I actually explained this in the previous slide, but this is ultimately the issue. We keep creating detections, and those detections fire alerts. And no matter what we do with tuning, it's ultimately whack-a-mole on just like, every time it's regular business traffic. Maybe we're lucky and it's like covers a huge swath of users who do that regularly, or systems that do that regularly. But ultimately, we're still ending up with a lot of alerts and a lot of time spent triaging alerts that aren't fruitful. So what's the magic of RBA? So I made this slide a long time ago, and I think it does a good job of breaking it down. So rather than what we had before in the previous slide, here's a log source, here's logic, out pops an alert. We're just introducing this intermediary index called the risk index. So now when we look at a log, our logic is putting things into the risk index. And I put at the top there, it's an interesting observation. I would say a potentially security relevant thing that happened. So the way we do that is with a risk rule. In ES 8.0, it would be an intermediate binding, utilizing the OCSF nomenclature. But when we see something security relevant, we just throw it in the index. We are not alerting. That is a further step that we will see in a second. So when we put something into the risk index, we're also including metadata, basically. So one I really like is score, because score can be dynamically shifted with something called risk factors, which we'll talk about in a second. But also like metadata about the MITRE attack tactic, Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, and even just the log source, because we're bringing it into a new index. So we do want to know what was the source type in the original log, so that we're bringing that forward and can use that metadata in an interesting way. So what I mentioned before about the dynamic nature of risk score, the reason I like this so much is because you can do a lot of cool things with it when you build it out. So for example, if the asset is high priority, we could bump up the score. Like every event that happens, rather than the score being 10, maybe we just add 10 to it because we think it might be more interesting and there's a potential for more threat or more risk. Or we could take just a CSV of crit vulns that are found on our machines, like run that every day once, and then we get an output of like the count of crit vulns on our assets. And if that count is above a certain number, maybe we bump up the risk score a little bit more. Another one I really, really like, because this is sort of like in a UBA-ish territory, is business unit outliers. So if I've seen this risk rule fire for this business unit like 100 times in a month, maybe I care less that it's happening again. So you could just bring that context into it, tweak the score down, because you know that it's regular business traffic for that business unit. And conversely, if that business unit has never fired that rule before, maybe I bump it up because now it's extra interesting. So we're like finding anomalies just based on count. So all that is stored in the risk index. I like to think of the risk index as like buckets for individual entities. It's stored on a risk object. That's our entity. So we're just sort of collecting events. We have a bucket for every entity in the risk index. And then we only alert when that bucket is full of interesting things. So we call those rules that create those notables in ES7.x and so on, and a finding in ES8.0. We use risk incident rules to bubble up those events all together so we can see them all together. We've got a bunch of events collected, and hopefully tells us a story that's a lot easier to investigate, as well as whether to confirm or deny whether it is malicious. So what can all that do for you? What is the benefit? So in the big alert pipeline, what we're used to, I mean, depends on the place. Depends on how things are built out. Same thing with how your risk-based alerting, curation is going to end up. But thousands of alerts per month is not irregular. Thousands per week is not irregular. That's what I was working with when I built things out. And just generally very low alert fidelity. And I mean, ideally, we use automation to deal with the high fidelity events because, if it's high fidelity, I can just take this action every time. Great, that's automated. But what about everything else? And a lot of things we can't automate because we don't know so clearly, and our true positive rate on those rules isn't very high. So as I mentioned before, you get this single event in isolation. It's disconnected from other security events, potentially difficult to build a picture around what's happening. Heavy alert fatigue from the constant triage of alerts that aren't high fidelity. You're just doing the same thing over and over, and sort of just lose perspective a little bit when the potentially malicious thing comes up. And then limited use with specialized data sets is like, for example, if I onboard some like web application logs from a web application in my company, and I have no other security relevant things to tie to that web application log, like maybe it's just an external IP address. Do I just search all my logs for that IP? That's certainly one way of doing it, but it would be nice if things were connected. So what we generally see, this number sounds crazy, but I swear it's true, a 50 to 90% alert reduction. Obviously depends on what kinds of alerts you have, what kind of detection program you have to start with. And if you've done a great job tuning that, maybe you'll get closer to the 50% range. But I thought I did a pretty good job personally when I built out my program, and I was getting 90% alert reduction as well. So very common to have numbers like that. Again, we can take things out of the queue that we know analysts are responding to over and over with the same, like, non-malicious, closed it out, looked at things, it's not worth looking at. And if that's happening 90% of the time, maybe it doesn't need to be a direct alert and it would be perfect in risk. So that's where you get those really great alert reduction numbers with the content you already have. And just, oh, why did I copy pasted very low alert fidelity? That's supposed to say improved. I wanted to maintain the colors of like improved. It's just the slide. I swear you'll have improved alert fidelity. But you know, anything is an improvement over 1%, 2%. You know, getting 10%, 20% is, you know, 1,000% improvement on those numbers. And we get the events becoming context. There is now a story that happened, especially as you build out, you know, more rules, you get more diversity of events, you get more of a picture of what's happening on machines. When I build things out and when I see people really thriving with RBA, I really like seeing like contextual events, like zero risk, but just so you know, this weird thing happened. One of my favorites, executable ran from a temporary directory. Happens thousands of times per day. Just people browsing the internet, just installing weird little things. But when it paired with other things, like, you know, weird phishing and web attempts or network attempts, you're like, oh, there is the executable. I found it. It's right there. And it was just brought to the surface because I had this contextual rule. And when we remove a lot of this time, these cycles spent constantly on alert triage, generally we find people have more time. RBA does take some time to build out. It's like, you know, it's a new methodology. You're doing things in a different way, and you got to structure things differently. But at some point, it becomes self-sustaining in a really powerful way, and we free up a lot of time for SOC to improve the maturity on all of their tooling, which is, in my mind, you know, the high value events that a security operations center can take is like threat intelligence, content maturation, and spending less time on alert triage. And then we just have so many applications for RBA. Like I mentioned before, if there's this weird web app with like, you know, we've got one rule detecting some weird thing on just this web app, you can make little baby RBAs for each sort of set of things. Like someone's coming to you with a web app, we could just talk to them for, you know, 15 minutes and be like, well, what are some interesting things you'd like to know? Get 3 to 5 things and craft them a little baby RBA that's just for their web application of those 3 to 5 things, and just let them know when like 2 things happen to one IP or one user or one system. Can be really interesting. So, you know, building baby RBAs is one of my favorite things, especially because then you're also crafting a limited use case versus malicious compromise, which is literally all of your events. Every log is relevant to security. But just some of those cases you can just build out with 10 to 20 rules and have something interesting and bringing you high value events to investigate. So here's an image from one of our friends over at Viasat. I swear, I told you the 90% numbers. It can be true. You can see they're hitting 1,000 to 2,000 notable events per day. RBA goes live, that's cut significantly. And then with just a week of tuning, that number cut even further down. And I can talk about some of the ways about how we can tune more easily with RBA. I think because it's like an abstraction layer, like everything's in the risk index, you can sort of see behavior at a large scale. Like what is, there's a concept called the threat object. It's like what the risk object did is the threat object. So it's like, with an IP or a domain or a file hash or a process. Well, if I just count by threat object on like distinct number of systems or users in my environment, I immediately see like, well, hundreds of users are doing this particular thing. Maybe I don't care about this particular thing quite as much. So you can automate a lot of that, and it makes tuning quite a bit easier. And you might ask, what about traditional detections? And that's a good question. I think it's important to note we don't want to replace everything with risk, but there are things that are better fits for direct alerts, and that's high fidelity, most importantly, at least 50% of the time, it's got to be the thing. Relatively low volume, even if it's high volume, potentially you can deal with anything that is high fidelity and actionable. Ideally, you can use SOAR for this type of thing. Any sort of automation product to just, take those actions that need to be repeated. This is the perfect use case for SOAR, is dealing with these types of events. And then for risk events, we can use it for enrichment, which helps our analysts make decisions because we're bringing in more information as an event comes in. But I like to point out that this type of alert is a point in time. It's the realm of the known. Like, we know this thing happened. I saw it in my logs. Here's an alert. The nice thing about risk is that we're dealing with the unknown unknowns. It's just sort of like, well, here's a few interesting things that happened. I don't necessarily know why these things happen together, but based on that metadata that we're using to bubble up this alert, that's interesting. And with risk, we can build detections on anything that is interesting to security. So it can be any fidelity. It can be high fidelity too, and maybe make the score more. But any volume. A lot of mature customers are, having millions of risk events per day in their risk index, but that's down from billions of log events in their overall data. So you get this, giant chunk of data, and you're still shrinking it down to a big chunk of data, but it's so much more relevant to what you're looking for. And so anything that is security relevant is interesting there. Just suspicious or low severity stuff, informational stuff, anything that is potentially risky can now feed into this picture of our story. And I think that's really cool. So here's sort of that movement I made with my hands earlier. But I mean, oftentimes there's a perception like, well, we are doing security because we have this many alerts, and you're telling me alerts go down, so isn't that less security? And that's why I made this slide, because it's really just like, well, when you have that much security data and you have, let's say, 100 detections, those 100 detections are the only 100 things you observe. Those 100 of things you observe are your 100 alerts. And the amount of true positives you're going to get out of that is relatively limited. But when we're working with risk, the number of observed events goes up drastically. We're looking at so much more behavior, and we're generating less alerts. So we're ultimately ending up with more true positives just by switching the sort of framework and observing so much more, because security should be seeing these things. So how does this look in practice? I will show in a moment a short little quick demo of just how it looks in the product. But here's an example in an insider risk use case. So you can see this sort of progression of, insider risk activity, email to a competitor domain. That's interesting, but good golly, I could never alert on that. That would be wild. But that's like, let's say that happened on the 2nd. Then 5 days later, the user's logging in at a weird time on Sunday. And then these two events on Monday, what I really like about that is the high number of files downloaded from a share or cloud drive, and then file activity to USB device. Those are great events. I mean, not great alerts directly, because that happens all the time, but great events. And then together, you'll notice they only happen an hour apart. I love when people are using RBA to like, well, when this and this are right next to each other, even more risk. Like, these are, in this example, each 25 points. But I would personally make a rule where, like, well, I saw these two events together in the same hour. I would make that probably a direct alert. That's pretty shifty to be doing so. And then on the final event here, the user filed their 2-week notice. So that creates a risk event. You could also, in that case, make a risk factor that bumped up the score. Like, now that they've put in their 2-week notice, everything that happens from that point is more interesting. You could also take a lens backwards on that and configure that as well. But the idea here is, if we had a 30-day rule looking for a score going over 100, now we're looking at a large time scale, so we can, potentially detect low and slow if we curate our detections correctly. But we get an alert that has, like, literally the whole story of them doing the thing from front to back. So here's an example from the lovely, amazing Matt Snyder, who has continued to talk at Conf, and he's got a great RBA readiness app that I'll talk about towards the end. But he mentioned And now Matt is a special case. He's brilliant, and maybe we all can't be Matt Snyder, but we see here even pre RBA, it's in Splunk. It took 1 to 2 days to still investigate someone, get all the relevant context. But with RBA, 10 minutes to investigate, because he was just bringing what was relevant immediately. There was no need to search for anything else. It was like RBA bringing the relevant things to the investigation. And like I said, he's brilliant. In 3 weeks, he built out those detections. He says here 52 detections in 3 weeks, which is wild. But also, I know from talking to him somewhat recently, there's even less detections now. Like like he built out what he thought would be relevant, and I think there's 30 or 40 in the current program. But regardless, Matt's great. He's got some great talks. Recommend checking them out. And then our friends over at Accenture, who've helped out a lot of customers with their own RBA programs, notable event counts dropping between 30 and 80% depending on the use case, and false positive rate reduced by 30%. Obviously, these numbers are going to be different, as I said, with each sort of different program that they're working with. But again, those are those kind of numbers that are really wild and not usually seen in the security space. Okay, I'm going to do a demo, and everything's going to work great, because everything's just going to work great. Okay, here's my Chrome tab. Okay, cool. I believe I am sharing. I'm certain I'm sharing. So here's ES Incident Review. I'm sure many of you are familiar with a large number of notables in that view. But let's switch to risk notables, because we can just see, oh gosh, there's this system process thing firing every dang second. We might tune out with a suppression, but we're just looking at way too much. So what I like, and obviously I've made the data pretty, but it's not unrealistic to have this sort of thing. So what I like is now I'm just sort of grouping everything by the entity. So we can see either systems or users, or the user of system, which always has way too much. Usually people tune out the system and the admin account because it always gathers everything from everywhere. But now I have these like risk events. I can see what the MITRE techniques relevant to those risk events were. I sort of shortened I like having a tight and sweet sort of list of fields here. So it just tells me the rules that fired, which is already interesting. I've got some next steps for how to deal with risk. I talk about in the guide how to do that effectively, like how to craft a playbook that's relevant to risk, because it's a little bit different. But I've just plugged into the risk object workflow action here to either use Asset Investigator, which is part of the SA Investigator app, which I love dearly. I also have this this dashboard that I built and I love. But if you're not familiar with the SA Investigator, you can sort of trim this to be these tabs to be relevant to the kinds of things you have. But what I like is, like, if I look at this asset, it's relating it to all the IP addresses and anything in the asset and identity. But I can see its notables. I've got all that here. I can dig into its risk. If I've got endpoint data, so there's risk events, threat objects that I was mentioning earlier. You can see they're just command lines. If I wanted to dig into endpoint data, I have that all here. SA Investigator, one of my favorite apps. Definitely recommend checking it out. You can edit any of the dashboards they have built in there. I also built out this. I did want to show also, just out of the box, you do have right here the risk events is linked blue. So when I click that, it brings out the out of the box sort of workbench for working with risk events, and that's the risk event timeline. So we've got the list of events in order. And if we scroll down here and I make my screen a little bit bigger because I'm on my laptop, individual risk events, I can do drill downs, but just if I wanted to investigate brief information about each thing, I can see a risk message with additional detail and a threat object and so on and so forth. But I love Splunk and I love making Splunk do stuff. So I like building out dashboards. So here's looking at that object. I could see, oh, here's a notable it had previously. I don't have the asset information working correctly, but it does that too. I could see the rules that fired along with the description, just so, if an analyst is unfamiliar with something, I'd love for them to get context about what that is. I make everything that is clicky blue just because we think blue is links. So if I wanted to see the SPL for that, I could see what it actually does and then just run it if I click this. But what I really want to show, beyond the timeline here, which is great, and the sort of breakdown of risk message and threat object, my favorite thing about RBA is threat objects, because basically it's like it's a library of behaviors of what are the entities in your environment doing. And threat object will tell you, which is really fascinating. So for example, if I click on netstat, I can just see every risk object which has fired this in my environment. Well, it's like, well, maybe if this fired 220 times, maybe I don't care quite as much. And as I mentioned, you can sort of tweak threat object to automatically tune down scores when they happen a certain amount. But I could look at something like, adding an administrator net command. And that's only happening on this Titan system. So maybe that's a little more interesting. But that's why I think threat object is so powerful, because it is an immediate view into what is anomalous and what is regular behavior. And so you can build out a lot of stuff on top of RBA with that I think is very, very cool. Oh, I opened new tabs, and so I wasn't showing. Okay, well, here's SA Investigator. Sorry, I couldn't see my notes, or I couldn't see the chat. So here's SA Investigator with the various tabs that you can break out and see in risk. Or if you have endpoint logs, you could see any of that. But again, one of my favorite apps. You can build it however you like to see all of that. Gosh, I'm so sorry I didn't show that. And here is my cool dashboard that I was talking about and you couldn't see. But I made links blue so you can click on them. Here's the notable. Here's the searches with little descriptions. If I wanted to see the SPL of those searches, I could query the REST API and pop out like what that search is actually looking for, and I could look at that. And here's my favorite thing, threat object. So here's netstat firing on so many objects. And that's maybe less relevant for me now, but versus someone adding themselves to the local administrators group only happening on this machine, which makes it a lot more interesting. Good golly, the demo worked, but I didn't work the demo correctly. That's how it goes. But yeah, that's just a quick review of what I just went over, because I forgot to hit the switch tab. Okay, back to slides. So I'm curious the use case that people are utilizing for RBA or planning to utilize for RBA. I built out some of the most common ones that I imagine here. Malicious compromise is sort of what I've been talking about as far as like everything's relevant because I want to find the bad thing. But I really like it for other use cases as well. Talked a little bit about how you can sort of build out like a UBA style thing. I mentioned ML because there's cool stuff you can do with ML as well. Okay, I'm caffeinated. Just let it go for a second. I'll talk about a few of these. I see in the Q&A, people are like, oh, we can't see what you're showing. So thank you for thank you for your concern. I wish I could put my brain in two places at once. Okay, we've got about 33%. I'll let it go for another 5 seconds or so. I know there's a delay. Oh, cool. And looks like we're getting some additional questions as well. Nice. Okay. Well, I want to see what the results are, so I'm going to click the button. Yeah, checks out malicious compromise. Oh, but we do have a decent chunk of insider risk people in here. That's great. There are some cool insider risk talks out there. I mentioned Matt Snyder. Definitely check him out on comp.splunk.com and watch those videos. Fraud, we've got a few people here as well, and we'll talk about some of the Splunk resources available for that. And I like that we got a decent amount of UBA ML type stuff. So I'm going to try to remember that we had a decent chunk of UBA ML people because I do talk about it in a slide coming up. but I think that is a very cool use case, especially when you have that library of behaviors. That's a great data set to use. Okay, so I'm running a little bit behind time, probably because I had to redo 3 minutes of my demo. So what about RBA in the next level? This is talking about some of those additional use cases, but also, firstly, I want to talk about my favorite thing to do with RBA, and that's purple teaming. So red team's great. We got to have red team to look at, where our potential holes are in our environment. But a lot of times it's a bit of an adversarial relationship where like red team just submits a report and we're like, blue team didn't find us. Here's the stuff we did. But a lot of times it's hard to craft content to truly catch them because they do a lot of sneaky things that aren't necessarily something you could directly alert on. So what I like to recommend, every pen test becomes so much more valuable. Great, red team turned in a report and they did all these things. Great, now that report is turned in, let's get red team and blue team together and build out content together. So what I find valuable about this exercise is like have red team come back, blue team on the call with them, and have red team do the attack again, front to back, literally the same thing they just did, and have blue team monitor every log source for that system and that user, IP address, whatever. Just find every single fingerprint they make. Because normally you can't make content on every single one of those fingerprints because they're happening all the time. But now that you've got RBA, if it's happening all the time, you could still include it as a security relevant observation. It doesn't have to be a high score. But if it's not happening that often, sure, make it a high score. And then if you aren't finding them in any logs, that's great leverage to be like, hey, we could have found red team if only we had those logs. To just sort of arm yourself with the sort of political capital needed to get more data for you to utilize. Because RBA thrives with more noise to pull out more signal. So while you're working with red team, find every fingerprint they made, make the new content, and now test them again. The next week, come back, you built out 5, 10 rules, let's say, and look how much earlier you catch them in the cycle because you've got these things, bubbling up together. And granted, obviously, it's a crafted scenario, but that's how you build out your visibility. And red teams are gonna have to get better. They can't use their same tricks of the trade when you find them every time in endpoint logs. So maybe then they start shifting to they do DLL hijacking. So your EDR agent doesn't even see anything that they do. Well, now you're gonna have to get creative and build more content on anomalous network activity, anomalous web activity, anomalous authentication activity, that sort of thing. Because now they've pivoted to something that's a little bit harder to detect, so you're going to have to level up your detections, and it just becomes this beautiful back and forth of escalating maturation. And then if you're looking for content, adversary simulation tools are great. There's a lot of free stuff out there as well. There's a lot of free detection sources. There's also research.splunk.com. But just to validate that your stuff does actually fire, as well as just thinking about, well, I have this type of data. What sort of things could I detect in this data source? So these types of tools are great for finding new content. And I mentioned research.splunk.com. Every single detection on there has like a data set. You can download the CSV or the JSON, and then you can just bring in that data, just add the CSV or JSON data to Splunk, and then just fire your detections off of it. Make sure that they're actually finding the thing you intend. Can be very valuable for a mature detection program. And then insider risk, my favorite thing. So, there have been a lot of tools out there for insider risk. I think DLP is a very cool data source, and it has tons of great data. But what I've found most of the time is that it has very low fidelity alerting. So we've got this tagging on like what are like crown jewelry type things, or what are just private information, what's confidential. But every time those files are accessed, if it's generating an alert every time like those types of files are accessed, and they're things in business use, a lot of times we just have very low fidelity alerting around that. But RBA is great for taking multiple low fidelity things and stringing them together when it's interesting, and making a much more successful program. So I mentioned, again, Matt Snyder from VMware's talk at conf.20 or .conf20, sorry. Definitely more of an overview of how they approached it, but he also has a great talk at MITRE ATT&CK Conference 2022. I have a talk there too, but it's pretty similar to this one. That talks more about the technical, what are the detections, what are the types of groupings, because they sort of found it was interesting. Certain detections indicated more so unintentional insider, where they submitted credentials and then attacker got inside, and so that's unintended. But then there was also detections that were more relevant to someone clearly utilizing their access in ways that a rogue attacker wouldn't know quite as well. So it's interesting that he was able to group detections in that way. And he's got more talks at Conf 21, 22, 23. He's got a great app for planning out an RBA journey and planning out content that I highly recommend as well. Suspicious external activity. This is sort of in the fraud category. We have things for detecting abuse of company points and stuff like that with the fraud app. But oh my gosh, some of the things that customers are doing in this area is so cool. One of my favorites is a customer that was doing something where they had a lot of bot activity, not quite DDoS, but in the sense that bots were trying to log in and do stuff. But the thing about bots is that there are a few things they do that humans can't do. So for example, with credential stuffing, if the same IP address is trying 3 different accounts in the same minute, that's weird. Even 5 minutes, 10 minutes is weird. It's either going to be a financial advisor or something, but that's weird. Weird thing number one. Another thing they do is they navigate too quickly between pages. So if you have Akamai data, for example, you can see what pages they load, piece by piece. And it's well, if they're clicking within 10 milliseconds of each other, that's not possible by a human. Or if they're skipping a page, normally to get to this page, you have to click this page first. So now we've got a list of behaviors that are interesting, that are generally only attackers are doing that thing. And now I could make a punch card of well, they did 3 out of the 5 weird things. Show me every IP address that did those 3 things. Instantaneously, you've got thousands of IPs available, and you're okay, great, ban them all, because you know that the only IPs doing that are suspicious or malicious. And you can immediately sort of just all that time attackers spend to build up their infrastructure, just make it so much harder to do attacks when you can detect their behavior at a behavioral level, what they're doing. So when you confirm that suspicious activity, you can find it everywhere and take action accordingly. So we do have the Splunk app for fraud analytics, which will give you a nice basis for how you might build detections. Obviously, it's going to be custom to the type of data you have, but it will give you ideas about how to build a detection framework around that and make something super cool. And okay, I'm going to speed up a little bit so we get more time for questions. Machine learning, I mentioned before, with RBA is great, sort of with referencing that slide earlier where we've got all that security data, but we're still observing a bunch, but it's less than all of the data. And I don't know if you have friends in the data science space, but most of them just spend time cleaning data. You're not going to get results without clean data. And the nice thing about RBA is that you're kind of pre-cleaning a data set to make it to, well, this is what's actually security relevant. And what you can do on top of that data is add metadata about what's firing. So when you get a confirmed incident, now you can apply that confirmed incident label to all that data. And now you're sort of building a picture of something for ML to point at and be well, these were previously malicious in the past. And you can sort of find the nooks and crannies of those connections with ML. So I've seen some customers do very cool stuff with this. And if you have correlations on external activity and IP address activity and rules that sort of cut down the noise to what's relevant to what those IPs are doing, you can build some very cool programs. So this is basically my final slide. We're streamlining security operations. The more time we spend and emotion we spend and cognition we spend, the less we have to use elsewhere. So the idea with RBA is that we're freeing up time freeing up the emotion of analysts working the same events over and over. And that frees up them to use their cognition for more interesting things and finding actual events. But I want to remind people that it is a journey. It's not like, here's the button, press it, and now RBA does the thing. You're gonna work with your data, work out the content that's relevant to you to build that program out. And we've got resources for that. I expressly want this to be easier to do. And the cool things I'm building for ES that will be in product next year will make it even easier. But you know, the end is just the beginning. Like I said, you can build little baby RBAs for little use cases, little contexts, and start there. But you know, once you build it out, you can just keep adding more features to it to make it more fleshed out. Like I mentioned before, those contextual rules with no score, just so you know this is happening. That is really cool content to build out once you've built out the more like, well, here's definite or more likely badness, but here are things that are just interesting and I would like to know about when I investigate. You can make it like almost like forensics light when you're looking at an entity. But yeah, you gotta start with crawling, then you can walk, but then you'll be running and then you'll be flying. So I am happy to point people to how to get there. So just a review of some of the resources. I developed a 60-page PDF. Don't worry, it's mostly screenshots, but just a very follow along, like here's step 1 of the journey, here's step 2, step 3, step 4. But that, if you Google the Splunk Guide to RBA, you'll find this page that I have the screenshot of. But download that. It's everything I've said and more, and literally just breaking it down step by step by step by step, how to do that. I mentioned the RBA GitHub there because there are some cool things you can do with RBA, just editing SPL to make it a little more particular to what you're doing and what you want to find and what you want to develop. And then we've got the RBA community, which is run by an external partner over at Outpost Security. But we've got Splunk people helping organize content and workshops. So if you go to the RBA community, first of all, we've got office hours every month. We've either got experts talking about a specific topic with demos, and then regardless of what they talked about, we've got live Q&A, so plenty of time to ask questions and get help where you are specifically. We've got a Slack that you know, don't have to wait for the office hours. You can just poke people in the Slack, and we've got a lot of people who have succeeded with RBA. You know, Matt Snyder's in there, tons of other folks from all over who have built out RBA, and I'll be in there too. So feel free to ask me a question there as well. We've got workshops occasionally about quarterly to deep dive into various things, and that website has a lot of resources. I especially like the apps section. There are a lot of great apps that I recommend to everyone. Splunk app for detection insights, one of my favorite. If you have ES, you have to have that app, and it's mentioned there. I will just mention it by name because I love it so much. And the next office hours is coming up December 17th at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So I will see you there. If you decide to join us, would love to have you. And yeah, now let's dig into the Q&A. Okay, we got a nice little collection here. So this one I will answer just because I've got a Christopher Makepeace asks, any advice on best approach in implementing a RBA in a multi-tenant network? I will say that the key there, honestly, is the asset and identity SIM entity zone. Entity zone allows you to distinguish between, like, obviously, we want to separate different private IP spaces so that they're, or actually, Christopher might be talking about, you know, multiple tenant RBA, where you are responding to alerts from multiple ES search heads. That one's a little more difficult. I wouldn't be able to cover it all in this call, but it is possible, and we have partners doing that sort of thing. But Christopher, reach out to me on the Slack, and we'll dig a little bit more into that so we can dig into some of these other questions. Oh, interesting. So Daniel Charbonneau mentioned reduces analysts chasing the same ghost when implemented. Saw same reduction, but more importantly, the overlapping work dropped and the hunting began a primary part of the SOC rather than just alerts. I love that. I love to hear that. Thank you, Daniel, for chiming in. Because yeah, when you're organizing things and aggregating things, you're looking at the thing less often, and you're only looking at it when it's relevant. And then you can sort of tie things together with alerts to you saw on my risk investigation dashboard, I was like, that button I clicked when I had it working for notables in the past 30 days, because I like seeing previous things that have happened for that asset. So, not spending the same amount of time investigating the same stuff, but also bringing in interesting historical context at the same time. Oh, okay. Here's the one where I was responding to the multi-tenant with this question. But Christy Hergenroder asks, how would you implement RBA in a cloud environment where multiple assets may share the same IP across multiple accounts? So that one of the ways that RBA deals with that is so we have risk object and risk object type. So generally, we just recommend system and user. There are other things you can do. Some people use like ARN in AWS, like the cloud role ARN, because then you can track like the role doing that particular thing. But the idea here is ideally you want to enrich as much as possible. You want to track the risk object like across system or user. So generally the golden grail, the holy grail with system is IP address to system. But if you can't get that, if you have IP address, that's better than nothing. There are also, so then you're aggregating events to system or IP, and then you're aggregating events to user. So the idea is if there is sort of like lateral movement happening or an attacker sort of splitting their behavior across different places, you would catch it where it's occurring and where you have a log that gives you that data. As you mature, you can try and get more out of that. Like I said, the holy grail is IP to system. That's typically tough, but you can get creative. There's, I will plug a wonderful product that I actually really like, is Splunk Asset Risk Intelligence. Does a lot of this for you. It's like, well, if I have this data in any place, I can string it all together and match it all up. But what I would say, if you don't have budget for that, but want to do something like that, it's like, well, where do you have IP and user, and where do you have IP and system? And then, so for example, VPN is often the connection between one or both of those, where someone logs in from this IP, and now we know it's this user. So every time we see that IP doing something, like the internal IP, it becomes. So that's one way of looking at VPN logs. Another good one is often proxy logs or web logs, where you have IP and user pretty generally. So you could utilize, how often, I don't know how often you would run that, because it might be an expensive search to look at all your data, but if it's in an accelerated data model, it would be very quick. But regardless, you could run that search somewhat frequently, so the IP address is more accurate for point in time. And make that distinction, well, it was probably this user or probably this system. And that's definitely one of the ways to try and get that type of visibility. Also, I would recommend these very traditional alerts that are not great alerts, but are great RBA events, is multiple IPs for one system, or multiple users on one system, or multiple accounts on one system. Any of those sort of combination of the three things. If 3 users are logged into the same computer, what's that about? And maybe you tear out your field services or whoever's doing like help desk and those sorts of accounts. But those rules are really, really great, especially when you've got like Okta data and you've got other things like that, because when that stuff shifts, that's really interesting. Lakshmanan Ganasan mentions, do we see any impacts to existing RBA risk rules and risk incident rules when ES is upgraded to 8.0? Great question. Ultimately, structurally, not too much is different. Language is different. So an RBA risk rule is now an event-based detection that generates intermediate findings. And then, things that were generating notables, so like direct events, are just findings. So it's an event-based detection that generates findings. When you upgrade, everything should just work. The difference is when you are saving a detection for the first time after a migration, well, now you have detection versioning, which is great. But when you save it for the first time, it's sort of combined the notable and the risk adaptive response action into every correlation search. So when you save like what would traditionally just generate a notable, it's going to ask you for like, well, what's the risk object and the risk score? So for those, the idea is we want to look at notables when we're looking at like a risk notable at the same time. So that's why that's there. And now notables will be in the, or findings will be in the risk data model. So you can get that visibility into everything that's happening on that entity. So you define a risk object and you define a risk score. But for something that used to generate notables, now generates findings, just generate a score of 0, because you're dealing with it already as a finding / notable. So you don't need to look at it again in the context of risk, but now it comes into the risk data model as context. So just make the score 0. That's the major change. The other nice thing is because now risk rules / intermediate findings, they now have the notable adaptive response action. And mainly what that allows you to do is add a drill down search. So when you're in the risk event timeline, when you click on that individual event, you'll have a drill down search available specifically to that risk event, which is really, really cool, because to do that previously, you had to jump through a few hoops. It was like behind the GUI a little bit. You could do it, but not necessarily easy. So those are the major things. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name, but great question. First alert is generated when user collects 100 points. We confirm it as false positive. This then alert is generated every time user receives any additional points. For example, +2, +5, generating lots of annoying alerts. Yeah, there's a few ways to solve this. So one of them, they're all kind of mentioned on the GitHub. There's a few interesting things you can do here. One is, because you're confirming it as false positive, and if you're actually using like the status or the disposition, you could be doing in your risk incident rules that generate your risk notables, you could do a sub search on the notable index for like, join on the risk object and then include the rules that fired and the disposition. And if the disposition, like just do an eval for risk score, like if disposition equals false positive, or if status equals false positive, or whatever you're using for that, then use the risk, use a score of 0. And if it's not, then just leave the risk score as is. That's one way of doing it. You can also, if you look on the RBA GitHub, I would definitely recommend checking that out, and feel free to reach out to me on Slack if you've got further questions about that. But you can also do something with a truth table in like, where like if analyst has marked as false positive and there's no new rules, or then don't let me know again, because I already dealt with it. But if a new rule fired, you may actually want to know. It's like, well, in this context with these rules that fired, didn't look bad. But sometimes when a new rule fires, then you don't want to ignore it. So you'd still like to see it. And yeah, it looks like we do have to wrap up for time. But again, we've got the RBA community, we've got the Slack. So if you've got further questions, feel free to reach out to me on there. But definitely check out the guide. And Whitney will send me the Q&A afterwards, so that we can I can reply individually. But thank you all so much for joining. I hope to see a few more signups to the Slack. And love to hear what people are doing with RBAs, and especially those folks that answered E. Like we're not getting quite the value we intended. Please reach out to me. I definitely want to hear about what's going on there, so that we can help you succeed. Because RBA, as you can tell, is one of my favorite things, and I love talking about it, and I love seeing people succeed with it. So thank you all so much for joining, and I'll see you at the next RBA thing, I'm sure.